Okay, so I want to hear what y'all wrote about in a minute, right? But first, what I want to know is if you have any questions about Candide so far, or about anything we went over last time, right? Is there anything that is, particularly confusing or troubling to you, or like anything that you want explained, or what have you? Give you a minute to think about that. Anything so far that's bothered you or that hasn't made any sense to you? Okay, then who wants to start? Okay, Michaela, go for it.
So, I chose the sentence. The kingdom is upwards of 300 leagues in diameter and divided into 30 provinces. They divide and possess all, and the people that they is a masterpiece of reason and justice. So, from this sentence, the binary I chose to focus on is the Father possesses all, and the people nothing. I think this binary shows the social status of the nation. It shows a sort of divide between the two, and I think it's important to consider all of the wrongdoings and how we can put the character's point of view to use. It may emphasize just one of the conflicts and helps one to a better understanding of what, how, and why things happen. It also might help build a connection between certain events that take place later down the line. Based on this binary, we can sort of guess the outcome of these situations, with knowing that all of the power belongs to the king. The government may not apply the term justice correctly or may not give absolute reason to certain principles.
Okay, yeah, I think you're on to a really good idea there, and I like that you picked that quote. It was one that I wanted to talk about today anyway, right? So the specific kingdom that Cacambo is talking about here, right, is Paraguay. Which was ruled in the 18th century by an order of Catholic priests called the Jesuits. Right? It was, essentially a colony carved out in South America by the Jesuits. So what does that tell us then about the object of criticism here? Let's remember what the French social structure we talked about last time was like, right? So what were the three estates we talked about?
Clergy, noblemen, and the other.
Yep. First estate was the clergy. Second estate was the nobles, and the third estate everybody else. And what special privileges did the clergy and the nobles have?
They didn't pay taxes.
They were basically exempt from taxes, yeah. And there were plenty of laws that applied to the third estate that didn't apply to the first and second estates, right? We're not going to get into detail about what those were yet, right? But suffice to say that the people who owned the most property also gave the least back in tax revenue, right? So they got to hold on to most of what they owned. And I think one of the things I think you're correctly pointing to here, Michaela, is that the phrase "it is a masterpiece of reason and justice" is meant to be ironic, right? It's that this small group of foreign priests who've come and carved out this colony, right, have essentially taken possession of everything. And if we look on the next page, where the commandant is having breakfast with Candide and Cacambo, right? Candide was at once conducted to a beautiful summer house, ornamented with a very pretty colonnade of green and gold marble, and with trellises, enclosing paroquets, hummingbirds, flybirds, guinea hens, and all other rare birds. An excellent breakfast was provided in vessels of gold, and while the Paraguayans were eating maize out of wooden dishes, in the open fields and exposed to the heat of the sun, the Reverend Father Commandant retired to his arbor, right? So, kind of pointing out the luxury that the Father Commandant and the other Jesuits live in compared to the harsh conditions that the average person in Paraguay has to endure, right? And so this is some stuff I want to pick up further as we continue discussion here, right? But what about what did the rest of you choose to write about?
Okay. So I said, so this is on, I don't know, I can't read Roman numerals, so this is on page 38.
Okay.
And I said, these sound reflections induced Candide to leave the meadow and plunge into the wood. He supped over there with Cacabo, and after cursing the Portuguese Inquisitor, the governor, Buenos Aires, and the Baron, they fell asleep on moss. So the reason why I chose that quote was because, like, I feel like it had like more of a deeper dive into really like what happened, into like of what he really experienced most basically. But that's the quote that I picked. Did you want me to read my free write as well?
If you could just kind of give me the gist of what you wrote for the free write.
So basically, I just put it with basically the gist of my free write. Yeah, and I feel like it had more of a deeper connection of how he actually viewed what his experience was.
Okay, and let's think about what that experience. What has he just experienced at this point? What's just happened?
That a monkey was shot, right?
Yeah, this is when he shoots the two monkeys who were chasing the girls, right? And why did he shoot the monkeys? What did he think he was doing? Let's maybe take a minute. Let's start on page 37 and kind of go through the whole episode. It's the beginning of chapter 16 if you've got a different edition. All right, so while he was thus lamenting his fate, right? So he's just murdered the Reverend Commandant of the Jesuits, and he's fled into the forest with Cacambo. He's feeling sorry for himself again. He does a lot of that. Right. While he was thus lamenting his fate, he went on eating. The sun went down. The two wanderers heard some little cries which seemed to be uttered by women. They did not know whether they were cries of pain or joy, but they started up precipitately with an inquietude and alarm which every little thing inspires in an unknown country. The noise was made by two naked girls who tripped along the mead, while two monkeys were pursuing them and biting their buttocks. Candide was moved with pity. He had learned to fire a gun in the Bulgarian service, and he was so clever at it that he could hit a filbert in a hedge without touching a leaf of the tree. He took up his double-barreled Spanish fusil, let it off, and killed the two monkeys. God be praised, my dear Cacambo, I have rescued those two poor creatures from a most perilous situation. If I have committed a sin in killing an inquisitor and a Jesuit, I have made ample amends by saving the lives of these girls. Perhaps they are young ladies of family, and this adventure may procure us great advantage in this country. So why do you think this episode starts with cries that they can't tell whether they're cries of joy or pain, right? And with the reference to the fact that they're in an unknown country. Why do you think it starts with that? What's going on here? What does that do to the situation?
It's basically making the monkeys portray as a bad creature, kind of. Right?
Well, yeah. Why does Candide assume the monkeys are bad creatures that mean the girls harm?
Because he sees like that they're biting their butts, or like kind of attacking the girls, basically. Yeah, and then he kind of determined whether if the tears were bad tears or good tears.
Yeah. So he can't determine whether they're cries of joy or pain, right? So he assumes they're cries of pain, right?
Mm-hmm.
Does this end up being the right assumption?
Mm-hmm.
He chooses incorrectly, right? And assumes that he's going to be rewarded for his good deed now. So what's really going on here then? What mistake has Candide made?
He's killed their lovers.
Yeah, he's killed. Yeah, the monkeys are actually the lovers of the girls, right? And so, in assuming that the monkeys meant them harm, right? What's the mistake that he made?
Shooting before asking the question.
Yeah, acting before thinking or like
Basically making
assessing
an
the
assumption.
situation.
Yeah.
Yeah. He doesn't assess the situation first. He relies on prior knowledge, right? To make an assumption about what he should do in this situation, rather than waiting it out to try to get to the truth of it. And so he's kind of doing the same kind of a priori reasoning that Pangloss is criticized for in the first third of the book, right? So does everybody remember what a priori means? If you're reasoning a priori, what are you doing? What are you reasoning? What are you basing your reasoning on?
Deduction based solely on theory.
Yes, exactly. A priori deductions are based on theory, not on experience. Now, to be fair to Candide, he has no experience of this sort of thing, right? But that's also pointed out as the kind of the problem here, right? Cacambo says to him, "Dear master, you are surprised at everything. Why should you think it's so strange that in some countries there are monkeys which insinuate themselves into the good graces of the ladies? They are a fourth part human, as I am a fourth part Spaniard." Right? So Cacambo, who has more experience of the world, tells Candide, don't think something's weird or impossible just because you've never seen it or experienced it. Right? There's plenty that has happened outside of your experience. All right. What about you, Colby? What did you write? What did you choose to write about today?
Mine was at the end of chapter 21.
Okay.
Well then, replied Martin, if thoughts have always had the same nature, why do you suppose that mankind has changed? Oh, said Candide, there's a great deal of difference because free will. I sort of wrote that, well, first I started, there's a binary there. Martin thinks that everything is, human nature is predetermined and all that, sort of like how Pangloss, everything happens for a reason and it's all. But Martin's belief is more pessimistic compared to Pangloss.
Okay, yeah.
But then I got to Candide, who free will has sort of not gotten him in good places so far. Getting kicked out of the castle.
Yeah.
All elves and stuff that happened in Paraguay. And that's basically it.
Yeah, and I think that what do you think the thing is that Candide doesn't quite get about free will? What do you think he keeps getting kind of hung up on here?
That it's what the same argument with free speech. Yes, there's free will, but it also means consequences exist.
Yeah. Free will and free speech don't mean consequence-free will and consequence-free speech, right? What you can do, what you can do and what you can say, I think the novel seems to argue, is going to be limited by your circumstances. Right? There are going to be factors that curtail your free will. There is another thing that I kind of want to point. So, yeah, we've kind of already associated like Pangloss and Martin with these two fatalistic forms of reasoning, right? Pangloss is fatalistic in that he thinks that there's no point trying to change anything because everything's already arranged for the best, right? And we see where that gets him. Martin believes that everything is already arranged for the worst, and thus nothing you do matters because everything's gonna turn to shit anyway, right? So they both have these kind of passive philosophies that seem to amount ultimately to kind of the same thing, in that they encourage you to not do anything, right? Although I would argue that Martin is probably at least a little bit more correct than Pangloss. He at least seems to point out some things to Candide that I think genuinely educate him. Like, we turn to page 52, right? After, or sorry, 53, right? After Candide has seen the ship owned by that Dutch captain who cheated him sink, right? So the ship is sunk, and he recovers one of his lost sheep, and everything's great, right? You see, said Candide to Martin, that crime is sometimes punished. This rogue of a Dutch skipper has met with the fate he deserved. Yes, said Martin, but why should the passengers be doomed also to destruction? God has punished the knave, and the devil has drowned the rest. So what is Martin's response to Candide illustrating about the view of the world that Candide still seems to be clinging to?
Candide is still overwhelmed and optimistic,
Mm-hmm.
saying that like everyone who gets punished for a reason.
Okay, yeah. And let's think about the specific reason why he thinks this Dutch skipper is punished, too. Who did the Dutch skipper cheat? Whose money was he running off with? And sheep. Yeah, it's Candide's money and Candide's sheep, right? So Candide is suggesting, right, this captain is being punished by God for cheating me, right? What does this suggest about Candide's view of the world and his view of justice? Yeah, that it's all centered on me, right? It's a very individualistic idea of what's just and what's fair, right? Because this guy who did something bad to me was punished, right? Then there must be justice in the world, right? Then the universe actually works according, is all for the best, and everything works according to these principles of right cause and effect. And then what is Martin pointing out to him?
That many more than just the one who cheated him.
Yeah. And was it right or fair, right? Was it just that these other people who hadn't harmed anyone also died, right? Just because this Dutch skipper ran off with your money and your sheep. So Candide at this point still doesn't seem to understand, right, that it's not just about what happens to him, right? That what happens to other people around him also matters and factors into what is or is not good or just. Now, I think we can probably relate this back to the episode of the earthquake that we kind of glossed over a little bit last time, right? But let's go back here to chapter chapter 13, right? So the earthquake here is important partly because this is the specific event that Voltaire, or that inspired Voltaire to write this book, right? So the earthquake that we're talking about is a real historical earthquake that happened on November 1st, 1755, in Lisbon, the capital of Portugal. Right, destroyed a good portion of the city. So, if we look on page 13, beginning of chapter 6 here, after the earthquake had destroyed 3/4 of Lisbon, the sages of that country could think of no means more effectual to prevent utter ruin than to give the people a beautiful auto da fe. Now, did y'all look up what auto da fe means? There's an end note there. Although, well, I guess this end note isn't actually helpful. So an auto da fe was a public punishment of religious heretics and dissenters in an almost kind of carnival atmosphere that the Inquisition, the Catholic Inquisition used to run, right? So they would dress heretics they were going to punish up in costumes. They'd whip them through the streets, and then they would, be publicly burned or hanged at the end of it, right? So the idea is, single out non-believers in the community, humiliate them, physically harm them, and depending on how bad their offense is, execute them, right? So it had been decided by the University of Coimbra here that the burning of a few people alive by a slow fire and with great ceremony is an infallible secret to hinder the earth from quaking. So what Voltaire is giving us here is more faulty cause and effect reasoning, right? Do y'all know what the post hoc fallacy is? Have any of you ever heard of this before? Colby, you're nodding. Do you remember what this means?
Kind of. It's like when faulty cause and effect, right?
Yeah, it's when you're missing it, when you assume that because one thing happens before another thing, that the thing that happened first caused that other thing, right? So, there's an old Simpsons episode, where, Lisa Simpson picks up a rock and tells her dad, I can just say this rock keeps tigers away, and you'll believe me because you don't see any tigers here, right? There's nothing special about the rock. There are no tigers because Springfield is in Oregon and tigers don't live in Oregon, right? But her father, who is not intellectually gifted, right, doesn't understand. Says, Lisa, I want to buy your magic rock, right? It's that same kind of faulty reasoning that, because there are no tigers here, this rock that I'm holding must keep tigers away, right? If we want to stop earthquakes, we have to burn more heretics. So, if we look at the next paragraph then, right? In consequence hereof, they had seized on a Biscayner, convicted of having married his godmother, and on 2 Portuguese for rejecting the bacon which larded a chicken they were eating. So, what does this suggest? By that they seized these 2 guys because they refused to eat bacon. What does that mean about them?
They might be Muslim.
Actually, more likely Jewish, but yeah, you're right. Muslims also don't eat pork. Yeah. After dinner, they came and secured Dr. Pangloss and his disciple Candide, the one for speaking his mind, the other for having listened with an air of approbation. They were conducted to separate apartments, extremely cold, as they were never incommoded by the sun. 8 days after, they were dressed in sanbenitos and their heads ornamented with paper mitres. The mitre and sanbenito belonging to Candide were painted with reversed flames and with devils that had neither tails nor claws. But Pangloss's devils had claws and tails, and the flames were upright. They marched in procession thus habited, and heard a very pathetic sermon, followed by fine church music. Candide was whipped in cadence while they were singing. The Biscayner and the 2 men who had refused to eat bacon were burnt, and Pangloss was hanged, though that was not the custom. The same day, the earth suffered a most violent concussion. So what's the whole reason that the people of Lisbon have put on this auto de fe? To stop earthquakes. And then what happens immediately after they complete this process? Another earthquake, right? Just kind of like driving home that point, right? About that enlightenment point about superstition, right? That the idea that supernatural beliefs should be superseded by science. Now, there's another issue at work here too, right? That I think has to do with those same enlightenment principles. So why is Pangloss hanged? What did he do to get on the Inquisition's radar here? For speaking his mind, yes. Basically for publicly expressing an opinion that was different from the Inquisition's opinion, right? So he's hanged for speaking his mind. Now, does the novel seem to think that it's fair to hang Pangloss? That his execution is in any way justified? What have we been led to think of Pangloss up to this point?
He's a fool.
Yeah, he's an idiot, right? And his philosophy is arguably actively harmful, right? By encouraging people to do nothing because everything's already great. And yet, does Voltaire seem to think that it's right for the Inquisition to hang him for speaking his mind? Even if the novel seems to think the things Pangloss says are dumb and possibly even pernicious. Yeah, it's a pointless death that solves nothing, right? And it's not for anything that Voltaire seems to regard as a crime, right? So I think part of the idea here, right, is that remember that like one of those Enlightenment principles was freedom of speech and information, right? And that even though everything Pangloss says is stupid, Voltaire would still argue that he has a right to say it without being molested, right? that he should not be hanged or otherwise punished by the church or the government for speaking his mind, even if it's to say something abominably stupid, right? So we can kind of link this up with what happens in Paraguay with the Jesuits as well, right? Because I think it's all part of a critique of the church that goes back to this whole idea of division into estates, right? There are, and I think the episode of the Jesuits also links this critique of the church to a critique of the nobility. Because who is this Jesuit commandant that Candide impulsively stabs to death? Who does this guy turn out to be?
What's her name's brother?
Yeah, he's Cunegonde's brother, the Baron of Thunder Ten Tronck's son, right? Who also turns out to not be dead, even though Candide thought everybody in the castle was dead, right? So this is something that, remember I mentioned last time, right? That nobody ever stays dead. Everybody who you think is dead ends up coming back later on, right? Just return after return after return.
People just keep on coming back from the dead.
Yeah. There's always some kind of improbable explanation as to why they are still alive.
Now in the book,
Uh-huh.
when people keep on coming back alive, is that more of like a metaphorical, like Flash is like talking about it, like talking about their lives, or is they actually coming back from the dead?
Well,
Like,
they are assumed to be dead,
okay.
and then they turn out not to be.
Okay.
So, then they tell their story and they give some sort of explanation
Right.
as to why they're not dead. So they're not literally getting resurrected.
So they're just getting their story told.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay.
They were apparently never actually dead in the first place.
Okay.
Right? It just looked like they were. But I think that can also that can tie in with some of the stuff you were writing about last time, about this kind of impulse to keep surviving,
Right.
or to cling to life even when life is shit.
Sure.
But the reason I wanted to come back to this part was to discuss why Candide kills Cunegonde's brother. Like, what happens between them that leads to this guy's apparent death. So let's look here at chapter 15, page 35. Let's go to the bottom of the page, right? The Baron could not refrain from embracing Candide. He called him his brother, his savior. Ah, perhaps, said he, we shall together, my dear Candide, enter the town as conquerors and recover my sister Cunegonde. That is all I want, said Candide, for I intended to marry her, and I still hope to do so. You insolent, replied the Baron. Would you have the impudence to marry my sister who has 72 quarterings? I find thou hast the most consummate effrontery to dare to mention so presumptuous a design. Candide, petrified at this speech, made answer. Reverend Father, all the quarterings in the world signify nothing. I rescued your sister from the arms of a Jew and of an inquisitor. She has great obligations to me. She wishes to marry me. Master Pangloss always told me that all men are equal, and certainly I will marry her. We shall see that, thou scoundrel. So, do any of you have any understanding of what's going on with the quarterings?
It's like a signifier of value, I guess, like nobility.
Exactly, yeah. So quarterings are essentially, they're little units on a coat of arms, right? And the more quarterings you have, the more connections to nobility your family has, right? So Cunegonde has 72 quarterings, right? That's an absurd number, right? This is meant to be an exaggeration. That Cunegonde is just that noble, right? Now, if we go back to the first page, when we're told about Candide's parentage, right? The old servants of the family suspected him to have been the son of the baron's sister by a good, honest gentleman of the neighborhood, whom that young lady would never marry because he had been able to prove only 71 quarterings, the rest of his genealogical tree having been lost in the injuries of time. So why can't Candide marry Cunegonde according to her brother?
He has one too few quarters.
One quartering too few, right? He's just not noble enough. And so, yeah, like we're meant to regard this as total bullshit, right? This is nonsense. This is pure and simple snobbery. But Candide responds to this obstacle like he seems to respond to most obstacles, right? What does he seem to happen when something gets in his way?
Tries to kill it.
Yeah. he impulsively stabs things, right? That seems to be the easiest way through his problems. And yeah, as long as there's a problem he can stab or shoot, that's what he does. But yeah, the whole thing about the quarterings, yeah, this is a critique of elitism, right? And the notion that who your ancestors were in relation to other people's ancestors even fucking matters, right? Now, watch this because it's going to keep coming back, right? But what we're seeing here so far is kind of the way the clergy and the nobility both kind of divide people up into classes and groups, right? You have allies and enemies, elites and non-elites, and so on and so forth, right? Now, what about in the kingdom of El Dorado that Candide and Cacambo visit together? How is El Dorado different from every place they've been before? What's this place like?
It's like a utopia.
Okay, what do you mean by a utopia?
It's well, in this case, it's perceived as perfect.
Okay, what's perfect about it?
One that sticks out is beautiful women,
Uh-huh.
beautiful men,
Okay, yep. Okay, everybody's good looking here. Okay, yes.
very large red sheep, which were faster than the horses
Uh-huh.
Candide was used to.
All right. Gorgeous people, magic sheep. And let's look at sort of some of the things that Candide learns about their society as well here. Right, when he's questioning the old man in chapter 18. Right, so Candide asks the old man whether there's any religion in his country. Right, page 44 if you have this edition. Right. The old man reddened a little. How then, said he, can you doubt it? Do you take us for ungrateful wretches? Cacambo humbly asked, what was the religion in El Dorado? The old man reddened again. Can there be two religions, said he. We have, I believe, the religion of all the world. We worship God night and morning. You worship but one God, said Cacambo, who still acted as interpreter in representing Candide's doubts. Surely, said the old man, there are not two, nor three, nor four, I must confess that people from your side of the world ask very extraordinary questions. Candide was not yet tired of interrogating the good old man. He wanted to know in what manner they prayed to God in El Dorado. We do not pray to him, said the worthy sage. We have nothing to ask of him. He has given us all we need, and we return him thanks without ceasing. Candide, having a curiosity to see the priests, asked where they were. The good old man smiled. My friend, said he, we are all priests. The king and all the heads of families sing solemn canticles of thanksgiving every morning, accompanied by 5,000 or 6,000 musicians. What? Have you no monks who teach, who dispute, who govern, who cabal, and who burn people that are not of their opinion? We must be mad, indeed, if that were the case, said the old man. Here we are all of one opinion, and we know not what you mean by monks. So let's pause and think about this for a minute, right? So what are the implications of this? What's the major difference, or what major difference between El Dorado and every place else does this point to? What's made this place a utopia?
Catholicism versus Protestant. They don't have the bureaucracy that Catholicism has.
Okay, yeah, they don't have any kind of bureaucracy, right? What? So yeah, there are no monks here, right? But why don't they have the bureaucracy?
Everyone's equal. You have the same opinion.
Everyone's of the same opinion, yes. So let's kind of lean into that for a minute here, right? What has made El Dorado a utopian society?
No conflicts between.
Yeah, no conflict. Good, yes, everyone agrees. And the thing I want us to try to consider here is whether Voltaire seems to think this is a good thing or a bad thing, right? El Dorado looks pretty great on the surface, right? Everybody has enough to eat, like not just enough to eat, but luxurious things to eat, right? Everybody's taken care of. But what else does he tell us about this place and its people? What's their experience of the outside world like?
Well, he thought the questions that he was asking him were strange.
Yeah.
They don't have much.
Yeah,
Yeah,
the guy's questioning him back, like, what are you, an idiot, right? So yeah, so that points to the notion that, yeah, maybe they don't have much experience with strangers, right? And in fact, we're even told on page 43, right? The kingdom we now inhabit is the ancient country of the Incas, who quitted it very imprudently to conquer another part of the world, and were at length destroyed by the Spaniards. More wise by far were the princes of their family, who remained in their native country, and they ordained, with the consent of the whole nation, that none of the inhabitants should ever be permitted to quit this little kingdom. And this has preserved our innocence and happiness. So this old man thinks Candide's questions are weird because nobody ever leaves this place, right? And it also doesn't seem to be all that common for outsiders to stumble in the way Candide and Cacambo do, kind of accidentally. And in a novel that seems to prefer reasoning from experience to reasoning from theory, can a place where you never really seem to experience much of anything actually be a good place? fact, this is a big part of what impels Candide and Cacambo to leave, right? It's like, if we stay here, this place is going to be boring. Right? We're going to get tired of this. We won't see anything new anymore. So, this kind of preservation of goodness and innocence, Voltaire seems to assume, is dependent on limiting people's experience and their exposure to new ideas and to difference, right? And as we're going to see, the only way that Candide can develop morally and intellectually is through exposure to things that that challenge his view of the world, right? So the last thing I want to point to on that count is going to, just before he meets Martin, when he comes to Suriname, he comes upon this slave who has been abused in a cruel manner, right? Who also just happens to belong to the Dutch skipper who cheats Candide and then gets his ship sunk, right? And if we look on page 48, and one thing that I do want to note here is that the language here is old-fashioned, right? And I think part of that is that, we're kind of directly translating an 18th century work that frequently used less enlightened terms. And also that in order to give you a cheaper textbook, I've assigned one that is an older public domain translation. If a more current translation would probably use different language, but this one is $3, and I prefer to have you buy a $3 edition than a $15 to $18 edition. Which now that I actually speak it out, sounds like a lame excuse. But yeah, I was basically trying to save you money. Okay, so as they drew near the town, page 48. They saw a man stretched upon the ground with only one moiety of his clothes, that is, of his blue linen drawers. The poor man had lost his left leg and right hand. Good God, said Candide in Dutch, what art thou doing there, friend, in that shocking condition? I am waiting for my master, Mynheer Vanderdender, the famous merchant, answered the man. Was it Mynheer Vanderdender, said Candide, that treated thee thus? Yes, sir, said the man, it is the custom. They give us a pair of linen drawers for our whole garment twice a year. When we work at the sugar canes and the mill snatches hold of a finger, they cut off the hand, and when we attempt to run away, they cut off the leg. Both cases have happened to me. This is the price at which you eat sugar in Europe. And I really, again, kind of want to sit with that for a minute, right? So the purpose of most slave plantations in the West Indies and that this particular part of South America was to grow sugarcane, right? And cane farming, on the one hand, right, produces a very high quality sugar. However, it is difficult and dangerous to grow and to harvest. And thus, slaves working in the cane plantations were frequently maimed or killed. Now, that didn't stop the craze for sugar in 18th century Europe, right? It's really only at about this time that sugar becomes really popular in Europe, because there's a lot of it coming from the New World that is being generated cheaply, right? And what can we say about sugar as a commodity? Is this something that people actually need? No. We can live without it, right? It doesn't provide any essential nutrients. It's basically just empty calories. And indeed, we'd probably be better off if we consumed less of it. But a big part of the point here, right, is to demonstrate the lengths that some people will go to make other people suffer to produce something that's essentially useless, right? So it's another knock at the idea that we live in a just world where everything is organized for the best, right? The whole idea here is that Candide keeps meeting with experiences that shake up this view of the world, right? If you continue to be the same kind of optimist as Pangloss after having all of these experiences, then you must either be insane or an idiot. And the thing I think that bugs me most about this episode is that on page 49, right, does Candide actually do anything to help this guy or relieve his condition? Right. "Oh, Pangloss," cried Candide, "thou hadst not guessed that this abomination is the end. I must at last renounce thy optimism." "What is this optimism?" said Cacambo. "Alas," said Candide, "it is the madness of maintaining that everything is right when it is wrong." Looking at the man, he shed tears, and weeping, he entered Suriname. So he's weeping over this man's plight, right? But does he do a damn thing to improve it? No, he just cries and walks into town, right? And I think like this is kind of a piece with that episode we saw where he celebrates the sinking of the ship, right? Haha, this guy who cheated me has been punished, right? Anything that doesn't touch on him personally, he doesn't have any means for processing yet, right? That's something that he still has yet to develop over the last third of this, right? His worldview by this point is still pretty self-centered. And it's largely about, what good things or bad things happen to him. Remember again that like this philosophy that he is absorbed from Pangloss encourages him to be passive, right? In the face of really just about anything, right? If everything's organized for the best, changing things would actually be bad. And then what he's going to learn from Martin is that because everything's already shitty chaos, everything you do is useless. So over the last third of this, he's going to come to a more kind of positive philosophy. And that's kind of one thing I want you to try to track that progress, right, over the last third of this, and see, what is the idea he finally comes to, and how does he get there? Okay, so anybody have any questions or comments about anything? Okay, so let me give you the reading questions for the end of this. And we'll come back and talk about it on Tuesday.
So the 19th.